So this is the image we ended up with at the last session. It's an image of M8, and we stretched it to the point where we got a reasonably pleasing image, at least at this image scale. The next step in sort of general image processing, once you have stretched the image, of course, is to noise reduce it. And the reason becomes very obvious if you zoom into this image. So what I'm going to do is some controls that we didn't use a whole lot last time. I'll just give everyone a quick overview of them here. This button right here, click that and your image will zoom to a scale of 20%. This button will zoom to 50%. This one zooms to 100%. I think this is 400% and so on. And then you can go up and down by, I've got it set to do it by 5% here, but you can actually control that in one of the system settings to zoom in and out by any amount. So I'm going to zoom to 100% here. Now, all of a sudden, that nice smooth image we had doesn't look so nice and smooth anymore. As you can see, there's all sorts of noise in there. And in order to sort of continue on with a discussion on noise reduction, this is going to sound very dumb, but we have to define what noise is. Now, noise is one of those things that everybody knows it when they see it. For purposes of what we're doing tonight, noise is any image artifact that you don't want that isn't in the scene. And there are many in this particular image. So we have hot pixels right here, which most people do not call noise, but it's something you want to remove from your image. We have the general noisy background here. As you can see, it's not smooth and quiet at all. And then as you scroll down, you can actually begin to see the nebula, and you will see that in the dimmer parts of the nebula, there is also a lot of noise. Is that reasonably obvious to everybody, given the compression that happens on Zoom? See a couple of people nodding their heads, so I'm assuming you can see that. The next thing I want to show you is you will notice as the nebula gets brighter, we'll get right down into the core of the nebula here, all of a sudden it looks like it's nice and quiet. And the simple answer is it is not quiet. It has exactly the same amount of noise as you saw out here, but the image is brighter. So what happens is the signal to noise ratio, which is literally what it sounds like, the amount of signal divided by the amount of noise, is higher. And the human eye isn't bothered by noise. It's bothered by low signal to noise ratio. So when you look at an image and it looks noisy, it may not be noisy. It might be fairly quiet, but it might have very low signal. It still has relatively low noise, but it's going to look noisy because the signal to noise ratio is low. And it turns out that's the key component to what makes a quiet image, is to get a high signal to noise ratio. It's why we stack many, many, many sub-exposures, hours worth of exposure, is to get that noise level down and increase the signal to noise ratio. So the reason I wanted to mention that is it feeds into a topic that we'll discuss a bit as we're going through here. There are two types of noise reduction. ImagesPlus has functions that do both, and it's very easy to turn one into the other. But the two types of noise reduction we're going to look at, one is called perceptual noise reduction. What happens with that rather is when the SNR is low, it does a lot of noise reduction. When the SNR is high, it does very little noise reduction. The reason for that is you want to maintain all of the detail in this area, but you want to be able to take all the noise out of this area. The other type of noise reduction, which ImagesPlus also does, and most packages also do, is called non-perceptual noise reduction. And that's just where it applies the same noise reduction across the whole image. It tends to blur out fine details, but it does a nice job on getting rid of all the crap in the dark areas. So What we're going to take a look at tonight, first off, is some of the tools for noise reduction, which ones are perceptual and which ones aren't, and how to turn a non-perceptual noise reduction tool into one that only reduces noise in the areas where it's noisy. And in the end, it turns out that that is one of the best tools in ImagesPlus after you apply the technique we're going to talk about tonight, because it's much faster than some of the others. So let's just take a look at some of the tools that are available. They're all under the Smooth Sharpen menu item. So we have standard smoothing and noise reduction. We'll get into that in a little bit. We have multi-resolution smooth sharpen. We won't use that much tonight. I'll just give you a quick introduction to the tool. We have reduce high-low bloom pixel. It's a really weird term. It sort of does exactly what it says. It reduces hot pixels or blown out pixels that are all black, that sort of thing. It can also help to remove bloom on old style CCD cameras. We have background and highlight smoothing. That's a perceptual tool. When you're smoothing the background, it only smooths areas that are dark enough to be considered background. We have a star size reduction and smoothing. We won't get into that too much tonight. That's a topic for another time. We have local smooth, sharpen, clone tools. That's the painting tools in ImagesPlus, and we won't get into those tonight, other than how to use them on a mask, which we will get into. We won't get into sharpening and texture enhancement because that's the opposite of noise reduction. That's what you do when you want to make an image sharper. Same with Van Kitterd and adaptive Richardson-Lucy restoration. Those are deconvolution methods, and we won't get into those tonight. That's for sharpening images. The custom point spread function is used with those two, so we won't look at that. Edge extraction and custom filters, we're not going to do anything on that. I don't tend to use the custom filter tool often. I have used it every now and then. But basically, you have to have an understanding of finite impulse response filters and digital signal processing before that is of any use to anybody. If you've got that kind of a background, which I do, it's my day job, these tools, defining custom filters right here, where you define a filter kernel, can be quite useful, but I would not suggest using them unless you've got that background. It's funny, that's a tool that shows up in every image processing package, this custom filter tool, and I've yet to find someone who actually knows how to use it. There are a couple of published filters and people will plug them in, but there are much easier ways of getting those filters. There is a tool here called, there's line enhancement, suppression, and band suppression. Those are awesome tools once you learn the procedure for using them. They are miserable tools if you haven't learned the procedure. They are used, band suppression is just what it says. If you've got a camera that has a dark band across the image, you can remove it using band suppression, but it's not easy to do. You have to do a whole bunch of things first. So we're not going to get into that tonight. That's a topic for a little more complicated processing later down the road. There is a frequency filter, and that is one of the most useful noise reduction tools once you learn how to use it. We'll get into that tonight. We won't talk about splitting an image into its frequency spectrum, although this is an exceedingly powerful tool for getting rid of pattern noise in your image. If you've got an image that's got diagonal lines in it or circular swirls, you can actually remove them using the frequency tool here. What it does is it prints up the spectrum. You find the area of the spectrum that's causing you grief and you paint it black. And then you switch it back to an image and your noise magically disappears. The unfortunate part is if you're not real used to a frequency spectrum, a hunk of your image can disappear too. So it does take a little practice. So at any rate, that's the sort of tools menu we're going to look at. We're going to start with the simplest one, which is the standard smoothing and noise reduction tool. So what this tool is, I'm going to zip over to a real noisy part of the image so we can see the effects fairly easily. So this tool is your basic blurring filters. Now, all noise reduction is one form of a blur or another. There are all sorts of different methods that people claim don't blur images. Noise reduction blurs an image. That is how it fundamentally works. These other really nice tools, a lot of them are available in Photoshop. They work well, but what they do is they apply the blurring to specific areas of the image, and we'll show you how to do that here tonight. This dialog box allows you to have a bunch of different filters. For those with a bit of a statistical background, we have a median filter. A median filter is really useful for removing, I saw some here just a minute ago, bear with me, up in the top corner of the image, for removing hot pixels. So here we have a bunch of hot pixels. And a median filter will remove those. What it will do, it will order all of the pixels inside, in this case, a 3x3 window. Now, I'll probably want that a little bigger, let's say 5x5. And it will order them from brightest to darkest. And it will simply replace the pixel in the middle of that little window with the median value. When you do that, median is middle, by the way. When you do that, it will remove hot pixels. So just to give you an idea here, we'll simply apply this filter. It should, if I did that right, remove most of the hot pixels. I might need a bigger median filter, but we'll soon see. But it'll also blur the image a little bit. The hot pixels are gone, as you can see. All right, if I just sort of pop back and forth here, I'll open the history dialog so I can, oh, I have to, 1 second. There we go. I'm just minimizing my video feed here where I'm looking at everybody so I can see my various toolbars. So if we sort of dial that back and you look in here, see the hot pixels. If we move it up this way, the hot pixels go away. The image also slightly blurs. Turns out there's a better way of getting rid of those hot pixels, and we'll look at that in a few minutes, but that's the predominant use of a median filter, is to take out what is called impulse noise, which is what hot pixels are. It's just a very abrupt, quick blip in the noise floor. Let me just remove that one. Yep. So this will pop the hot pixels back. The next filter we're going to look at here is called a Gaussian blur. The rest of these, Gaussian, binomial, and box, are all standard blurs. So if we do a Gaussian blur, you can see what's going to happen. It's going to blur the image a bit. How much it blurs is dependent upon the size you pick here for that Gaussian shape. So this is a 5x5 blurring kernel. And if you take a look, it will blur the image. It won't make the hot pixels completely disappear, I don't think, because it won't have blurred them enough. But you can see what it did. It slightly reduced the noise. The stars blurred a little bit, and it took the hot pixels down, but did not completely remove them. Now, what we're doing here, and I should have made a slide for this. 1 second, maybe we can do it this way. If I say, make me a new window, we'll make the window black. Okay, and I'm going to draw on this just to show you what's going on here. Now, there we are. So what we're going to do here, I'm going to draw this shape. It's very poorly drawn because it's drawn with a set of tools that really aren't meant for drawing, but it's also drawn with a mouse on my computer here. Okay. Really poorly drawn, but you get the idea. This is a low pass filter. So what we're seeing here, frequency increases in this direction. This is amplitude. The filter is flat here in that it doesn't filter anything. Then as the frequency gets above a certain point, it starts to lower the amplitude of those frequencies. What happens with a blurring filter and why it takes out noise is most of the image data is here in the area that the filter doesn't affect. Out here in the area that the filter rolls off is all the high frequency noise. That's the quick transitions in pixel values, which you can see if I undo that last filter. Okay, let's try that again. I'm on the wrong image. Let's go back to this image. There. So you can see that quick variation pixel to pixel in here. If I really zoom in on this, let's go there. Now you can really see the quick, abrupt transitions pixel to pixel. That's all high frequency noise, and that's what we're removing with this blurring filter. We're actually getting rid of some of that. The problem with that approach is that it also gets rid of some image detail. Most notably, if I just turn this blur filter up a little bit, 1 second here. So this is a slight blurring. We're going to turn the blur up a little bit. So we're going to blur the image more. Now you can see, notice the stars have gotten a little blurry. You can see that if I undo the effect of the filter, watch the stars. The stars are, relatively speaking, sharp. And then when I do that, you'll notice the stars get a little fuzzy. There we are. So does everybody see what I'm trying to demonstrate there? That a blurring filter tends to help remove noise, but it also tends to blur out some of the fine detail in the image. If we go and take a look at the nebula as an example, okay, everyone see this detail in the nebula, this little sort of crescent shape here. If we apply the blurring filter to it, I gotta apply it a little more to show the effect here, 1 sec. We'll do something like this. So we'll sort of take all the noise away, but look at what it did to the image. See how that blurred right out? But we have a nice smooth image with very little high frequency noise. Wouldn't it be nice to be able to target just the background with that? It turns out there's a way. We'll get into that in a few minutes. So we've looked at sort of the normal non-adaptive filters here. There is, however, some adaptive filters. So what the adaptive filters do is they attempt to preserve as much image detail as they can while still blurring out the noise. So selected neighborhood is a reasonable filter. And if we apply that, you'll notice it didn't blur the image as much. It reduced the noise somewhat, but the stars are all relatively sharp. Another one, absolute difference, what this one does is this looks at the data and it attempts to minimize the absolute difference between adjacent pixels. The idea being that high frequency pixels change faster than low frequency pixels. So 2 pixels close together that vary are almost always noise. And it will attempt to reduce that without blurring the data that changes over many pixels. I'll run this. It takes just a second. So what I'm going to do is, 1 second, I'll just do undo here. So we get back to the noisy image. I'm going to take just a small section of this image so that this part runs faster and people can see the effect. We'll just grab this little part of it here. There we go. So we'll run it on this. And if you take a look, if we now run the absolute difference filter, you see it did a reasonable job of smoothing, took out a big chunk of the noise, and it didn't blur the data too much, not anywhere near as much as a big Gaussian blur that was required to get the same smoother background. So it's not a bad filter. I've yet to have a good use for quantile filtering and adaptive median. They are sort of specialized filters, again, for removing hot pixels and that sort of thing. The other thing that you can do in this smoothing and noise reduction window is, and this happens in a lot of ImagesPlus tools, you can set the minimum pixel value that this filter will be applied to, and you can set the maximum pixel filter that it will be applied to. So now I'm going to give you an idea what that'll do for you. Remember how we said, gee, it would be nice if you could only affect the background and not affect this area too much? Watch what happens. If we just undo the last filtering run here. First, I'm going to do a blur with a 15 pixel wide Gaussian, and watch what happens. The image will get a little blurry. See that? Now what we're going to do is the same thing, but we're going to set the levels that it's applied to. So for instance, The minimum, we're going to leave at 0. So any pixel value, you know, that's down at 0, we want to smooth out. But we don't want to smooth anything that's really sort of above this value, right in this area. So you set the maximum value, you click on the image, and you notice it set the slider to the level of this area. You never want to have a very abrupt transition, so you have some feathering here to just sort of blend it in a little bit. And you just dial that up a bit. Now watch what happens when we do the smooth. See what happened? We still have sharp stars. We have lots of detail still down in this bright area. The dim areas got the full effect of the filter, and it blended in between the bright areas and the dim areas. So you can see the effect. Right? It's now beginning to take a filter that is not perceptual, meaning it applies to everything, and it's adding some context to it. It's making the filter only filter out the darker areas of the image, which is what you want to do, because the bright areas have high signal-to-noise ratio, and you really don't want to remove the detail in those images. It's not the best way to do it, because if you zoom in a bright area here, right there, you'll notice there's still a little bit of noise. We can take that down using different techniques, but I just wanted to show everybody this tool does have the ability to limit the brightness range over which you apply it. And that happens with a lot of ImagesPlus tools, and it's actually fairly powerful. So that gives you an idea of sort of the standard noise reduction tools. And they do a reasonable job, as you can see. If we go back to now the full image right here, and we apply this same blurring filter to that image, now I'm applying it to the image as a whole. And if we zoom out a little bit, say we zoom out to 50% here, so you see more of the nebula, you still have a reasonable image. It's got lots of detail in the core. It's got good noise in the edge of the nebula, and it's got a reasonably smooth background. If we undo the application of that filter, watch what happens. Now you can see all the noise that showed up here and in the background, and this area looks pretty much just like it did in the filtered version. So that's a simple way. That's one of the simplest noise filtering tools in ImagesPlus, is this smoothing and noise reduction. Generally, it's applied to the whole image, and you can make it affect different brightness levels in the image with the minimum apply, maximum apply, and feather. Minimum apply, if I slide this up, now it won't remove the noise from the dark background, but it will only remove the noise between this brightness value, which happens to be 8671, and this brightness value, which happens to be 20,097, and it'll feather it a little bit on either end, blend it in by feathering it by, you know, a count of 2109. So basically, at this value, it will be unfiltered, and then the full effect of the filter will show up 2109 pixels, 2109 counts later, and it will blend from no filter to full filter over this range on both ends. That gives you an idea of how that tool works. It's a reasonably powerful tool that works well in some images. If your image, however, has lots of small, tight stars, these tools will tend to remove them, or at least blur them. Sometimes that's what you want, other times not so much. So let's remove the effect of that filter for a minute. There we go. And we're going to zoom back to 100%, and we're going to take a look at these hot pixels. The only filter that we talked about so far that eliminated those hot pixels at the expense of blurring some of the smaller stars was the median filter. Well, there's a tool designed specifically to remove those hot pixels, and it is this tool called Reduce High-Low Bloom Pixel, ... The name is a little longer than that, but Mike couldn't fit it all in the space he had. So what you do here, you select whether you're removing low pixels, that's black pixels, basically pixels that are blind. Most cameras have a few. You can remove hot pixels. You can remove both black and hot pixels, and this is for removing bloom in older CCD cameras. What you want to do here is you want to select a window size for your filter, generally for hot pixels where it is only 1 or 2 pixels in size. These are about 2 pixels in size. 5 by 5 works well. You can increase that if you want. It's just basically the size of the median kernel that's going to get used. The effect size, just think of it as how big an area it looks at to apply this filter. And then this slider sets the strength of the removal. So for instance, if we want to, I'm about to point at my screen with my hand, that doesn't do you any good. If we want to remove these hot pixels here and here as an example, all we do is we take this and we slide it up toward most reduction. Watch what happens. Gone. And it didn't affect anything else in the image. The stars are just the same as they were, but all the hot pixels are gone. It's a very useful tool for removing hot pixel type noise in your images. You can apply more, you can give it more or less reduction of those hot pixels. I generally end up sliding it all the way up because for the most part, you want to take out all of the pixels, all of the hot pixels rather. But you notice it didn't do anything to any of this other noise. It's still exactly as it was. Right? It doesn't affect other parts of the image, just the hot pixels, just really tiny variations that are usually 1 or 2 pixels in size. That's what that tool is used for. Any questions so far? Okay, I will keep going. By the way, if anyone has a question as we go along, don't wait till the end, just sort of shout it out and I'll try and answer it right then and there. The next tool we're going to look at is the next one on the list here, background highlight smoothing. It's actually a really powerful but outrageously slow noise reduction technique. Keep in mind that the processor I'm using is a quad-core i7 running at about 3 gigahertz with lots of RAM, and it's still quite slow to use this tool. It's an iterative tool, so what it does is it runs one iteration, then it examines the image again and runs another iteration on that, and it keeps going for however many iterations you select. You can blur the image in 3 bands: the finest detail band, the fine detail band, and the medium detail band. It's a wavelet-based tool for those that are interested. You can, just like we did in the previous round, you can select the screen brightnesses here. You can select background, and then it will only apply over this pixel range right here. You can select the midtones or highlights here. So you might have a bright area of the image that you want to smooth out rather than a dark area. I haven't yet figured out why you want to do that, but hey, you might. And you can also select a range from the image by clicking this and then just click in the background area. So if I want to remove something in the background, you notice it just slid the slider up a little bit because my background now has sort of that pixel range. You can also set a feather range. You almost always want to apply a small bit of feathering. You can tell it how aggressive to be with the noise reduction right here. You can say make it really aggressive or a little less aggressive. And then you select the number of iterations. Now I'm going to take, the way all these tools should be used, you take a small section of the image. So I'm going to take this section right here. And you make all your tests on this small image because this tool takes so long to run. When you're finished getting this just the way you want, you go back to the full image, click apply, and go get coffee. But this will give you an idea of how this tool works. So you can see this is the image we're looking at. All the hot pixels have been removed. Now I'm going to click, I want 3 iterations. The 3 is not a magic number. If it takes 6 iterations or 12 iterations, select whatever is required. And then I'm going to click apply. I'm going to do one thing before I do, and I'm only doing it for demonstration purposes. there's this step through. What this will do, it will stop at every iteration and I have to click next. It can be useful, but for tonight, I'm just doing it so you can see how things work. We click apply and we let it do one iteration, and there's one iteration done. So if we sort of then say, give me the next iteration, there's 2 iterations, and then the next one. So this will be 3 iterations. There. Now, if we flip back and forth between the filtered and unfiltered image, look at all the noise. Then I'm going to apply what we just did. See all the noise go away, or at least get greatly reduced. However, the detail hasn't disappeared. So it's a reasonably good filter. The stars are still sharp. There's a little bit of blurring in the nebula, but it's not outrageous. And you can control that by setting the luminance here maybe a little lower. And you can also control how much blurring happens in the fine detail range. If you look closely, you'll notice, see this noise in around this area? Can everyone see that, or does the compression on zoom make it go away? So?
It's sort of smoothed out a bit. It doesn't look too bad.
Okay, it's not bad, but maybe if I zoom in even more here, you might be able to see. That's kind of a lot. One sec. If I go a little past 100% here, maybe we can now get a look at this high frequency noise that I can see quite clearly on my screen here. Can you begin to see it now? Just in sort of that area and down here. It might be being smoothed out by the zoom compression a bit as well. If I take this slider and slide it up a bit, about there, and then I tell this to run again, now it's going back to the original data, and then it's going to apply the filter. There's one iteration. Oh, I have to hit next, sorry. Working on the second iteration. And now the third iteration. The really fine-grained noise that was in this area is now gone. But what it's done is it's blurred the stars just that little bit more. So I generally try and keep this as low as you can and remove the bulk of the noise with the fine and medium sliders. But you can see the effect. You can also see how long it took to run on something that's only 946 pixels by 671. The size is down here, by the way. It takes quite a while. So for instance, if I just tell this to run by itself, this is just a small portion of the full image from my camera. So you can see it takes quite a while, even on a small portion. So you can imagine what it would take on the full image. Give you an idea, the filter on the full image would take a good 5 to 10 minutes to do 3 or 4 iterations. It's, however, quite a useful filter. It's not my favorite filter, mostly because it takes so long, but it does work quite well. Next on the list here, we've pretty much come down. We're going to come down now to this frequency filter. And it is my favorite filtering tool, and not for the reasons a lot of people would expect. It is very flexible. It's done in John, you will know what I mean when I say this, in the frequency domain. So what it does is it converts the image to a spectrum. It applies a mathematical filter, happens to be a Butterworth filter for the most part, to the spectrum, and then converts it back to an image. The nice part about it is you get different types of filters than you can get with the standard filtering set. You get a low pass, which you get with the standard filter set. You get a high pass. You also get a band pass, so I can remove high and low frequencies. And I get a band stop. So for instance, if I had lines running through this image that were evenly spaced, I could select the frequency that those lines exist at and remove just that frequency with a band stop filter. and remove the lines. It's just another way of doing it. Comes in quite handy. But for what we're doing right now, we want a low pass filter because we're doing noise reduction. And as I said, all noise reduction is a blurring process. It's a low pass filter. Problem now, if I apply this filter and I apply it to the whole image, watch what happens. This is just the default settings here, by the way. All the noise goes away eventually. Takes a couple of seconds to run. It's running on the whole image now. You can see that it's running because it says operation in progress up here. Notice most of the noise is now gone. The stars blurred out a bit. Everybody see that? Okay, if we now go look at the area of the nebula that had all that nice, wonderful detail, it is also blurred out just a little bit. This is a non-perceptual filter. It applies equally to all parts of the image. So now we're in the core, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to roll the filter back here so you can see the difference, and you can see how much it's blurred the image. Everybody see the difference? Okay, it would be really nice to be able to get that really nice smoothing capability of this particular filter, or any filter for that matter, but only apply it to the areas that need the noise reduction. There's a way to do that. Now, the way we're going to do that is we're going to use a mask. Now, is everybody watching familiar with the concept of a mask in image processing? I see one person shaking their head, one sort of. I'm assuming that wave was, you know what I'm talking about, John? And so we're going to use a mask, and we're going to use the mask to limit where that filter gets applied. So the way a mask works is where the mask is white, the full effect of the filter will be applied. Where the mask is black, the filter will not be applied at all. And then varying amounts of the filter will be applied depending upon what shade of gray the mask is. What we're going to do is this. ImagesPlus has a whole whack of mask making tools. They're under the special functions menu. Here's our image. We want that image though before any noise reduction is applied. So I'm just going to back up one step here. We'll get rid of the noise reduction that I applied. Oops, I backed up one step too many. I got my hot pixels back, I think. Let me just verify that. Nope, okay, I'm back where I want to be, no hot pixels. So first step was to remove the hot pixels. Now we're going to apply the mask, but we don't want to apply it to these stars. We only want to apply it to this black background and have it sort of blend into the nebula out here where the nebula is noisy. So the way we're going to do that, as I said, is to make a mask. And the way we're going to make a mask is special functions, mask tools. We're going to make what's called a luminance mask. Now, a luminance mask is nothing but a grayscale version of that image. So there you go, that's a black and white version of that image. Everybody see that? Then we're going to invert this. So we're going to make the light parts dark and the dark parts light. The reason for that is we want to apply the filtering out here in the dark parts, not in the light parts. Everybody follow what I'm saying there? So now what we're going to do, we're going to take that mask and we're going to invert it by selecting negative under the mask tools. And there it is, it's just inverted. But we don't want to remove too much of the detail out here, only in this area where the nebula falls into the background. So what we want to do is we want to darken that mask up. Any of the stretching tools we talked about last time will work. I tend to use levels for this. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to use a levels adjustment. This is the histogram. I'm going to darken up a big chunk of the nebula, just like that. And I'm going to make the background as light as I can get away with. So we go white, and we'll slide this up to about here. So now we have a reasonably light background. We have a dark central area, and you notice all the stars are almost black. We're going to use this mask. You click.
Is that level?
Sorry, Troy, I'm assuming that you talking, you're coming out fairly garbled.
Do you know where was that levels part?
Oh, okay, sorry. It was under the stretch levels. Okay. So now we have our mask. We have to save it as a mask. The way to do that is click this button, Save, then Copy Mask. You don't have to. You could just click this Save, but the nice part is this copies it to the clipboard and you can paste it in where you need it. So you just click Save. I'm going to save it. I'm going to call it Mask NR, which for me is noise reduction. And I'll say save that. Click OK. Now I have this mask saved. Now we're going to go back. I'm going to look at this image again. And I'm going to attempt, if I can do this right, to get over here where I have some detail in the nebula. This sort of crescent-shaped area here. And you should be able to see the noise up here. Can everyone see that? Okay, what I'm going to do now, I'm going to use this low-pass filter that we just used, and I'm going to simply apply it. And it's going to blur out the image. It's also going to blur out the stars once it finishes. Okay, so there we have a nice, reasonably smooth background, but everywhere else is way too blurry. Now we're going to apply that mask to that operation. You click the History window button right here. You come down here and you click the Mask button. ImagesPlus has two types of masks. It's got a very powerful masking system, but we're going to use the mono image version. And then you go up here and you right-click and select Paste Mask. You can also load the mask with the Load button. You can load it directly from the disk with a File Open dialog. So we paste that mask in and watch the magic happen. Now we have sharp stars, smooth background, smooth nebula, but with all of the detail that was in the nebula. You see that? And if we go back now to the core of the nebula, it still has all of the detail that it had, and all the stars are nice and sharp. The one thing it does is this darker area here lightens up just a little bit. I could then paint on the mask black along this area if I didn't want that to happen, but it turns out it actually helps reduce a little bit of noise in there, so we'll leave it in this time around. You can see the effect of using the mask versus not using the mask. I can turn the mask on and off here. So if I turn the mask off, watch what happens. See how everything blurred? Turn the mask on, and everything sharpens up. Now, here's the other nice part about it. With the mask, I can get a little crazy with the amount of filtering I put in. I selected the nominal value here. There's still just a little bit of noise out in this area. Hopefully you can see that. But because I have a mask protecting all the detail now, I can turn up the blur. And I can make most of this just smooth right out. Once it finishes. And you can tell it's doing something because it says operation in progress. Now look how smooth this area got. But watch the core. It's still got most of its detail. And I can make it have all its detail by making the mask a little darker in the core area. But you can see, watch what happens without the mask now. I've put a substantial blur in this image. So without the mask, look at it now. With the mask, still a reasonably sharp core. You've got lots of detail in the gas clouds here and around the core area here. And look at what it did to the background. right? So there's noise reduced. Get my filter dialog back up, or history dialog. I'll turn the filter off. Look at the difference. Turn it back on. Substantial difference. But you still have all your stars. You didn't blur them out. The mask protected the bright areas of the image where the detail exists and blurred out the dark and allowed the filter to blur out just the darker areas. Anytime you do noise reduction, even if you use some of the built-in functions that are supposed to be perceptual, you should still use a mask. It does such a good job at preventing the core from being destroyed. I mean, there's a little bit of blur in that core, but not much. So here's no filter. There's no filter. Here's the full effect of the filter with the mask on. We're looking at the core. Not a lot of difference. So you've got all that detail. You got rid of all the noise out here, or at least a big chunk of it, and you still kept the stars. And you can go crazy with the filter once you have the mask in place. I can really blur things, even to the point where I'm now beginning to lose some stars once it finishes here. And all it requires is that I stretch my mask a little more and I get all my stars back. Yeah, just lost a little bit of the stars, not much at all. But look how smooth that background got, right? So you can see, and if I take the mask off, watch what happens. All the stars blur right out, right? That's what a mask will do for you when you're doing noise reduction. You always want to use an inverse luminance mask when you're doing noise reduction. All that is you generate a mask from the image, you make a black and white version of the image by selecting Luminance Mask, and that just makes a black and white copy of the image. And then you negate it here. And then once you do that, you use levels or any of the other stretch tools to darken the bright areas of the image of the mask. So you get a mask that looks like this. Now you can see where this is black, the filter will not be applied. It varies on the way out. So where the nebula gets dim and approaches the background, you'll start to apply more and more filtering to the point where you smooth the nebula quite nicely in areas like, get over here, in areas like this transition region in here. If we don't apply the filter, you can see the difference in that area. So come down here, watch this area. See how noisy it got? Right, there's still nebula there, but it's very dim, so the signal to noise ratio is quite poor. When you filter it, you remove all of that, but you keep the stars, as you can see, and now you can see the nebula. And that's really the foundation of noise reduction. It's blurring with the appropriate mask to give you to limit where that blur gets applied. For instance, if we zoom out here now, maybe that's a little too much. We zoom out so we can see more of the image. Look how nice and smooth that image is, but it's still got all that wonderful detail that we had through this area and in the core. Right? All a function of applying the mask to a noise reduction. That same technique, for anyone that works with Photoshop, that same technique works well. It works with any blurring filter. I could apply that standard Gaussian blur that we discussed earlier, and it would do a really nice job at limiting where that blur is applied. The reason I didn't use a standard Gaussian blur is I happen to like the flexibility of the frequency filter more. I didn't discuss all of the options here, but I'll show them to you in just a couple of minutes. I can vary the decay and the width of the filter. I can scale it. I can do all sorts of interesting things with it. But I just wanted to show that in terms of noise reduction, it's one of my favorite noise reduction tools. All it is a low-pass blurring filter when I use just the low-pass section of the frequency filter. But look at the job it does when you use a mask. It just takes out the background noise completely. See how nice and smooth this area has become. Watch this area in particular right here in this area. If I disable the noise reduction, watch how crappy this area becomes. See that? You get all sorts of noise in this area here. It extends all the way down to the point where when you get down here far enough, you can't tell what's a star and what's noise, right? Turn the filter back on and the stars pop right out and the background smooths right out. You can see that the nebula here actually extends down into this area. You can still see some of the orangey reddish glow in this area, all because you applied a filter and limited its effect to the dimmer areas of the image just by using a mask. Any questions? If you're asking a question, John, you got to unmute.
Apparently, pressing the space bar does not unmute you. Just for my own edification, I'm kind of thinking this is sort of a dial by numbers comb filter.
No, it's actually just a low pass filter, and you're limiting where it's applied. A comb filter would take out different section. It's like multiple band passes. This is just a low pass filter. So it's, remember that low pass filter that I drew? Yeah, you're applying that filter, but you're applying it fully down in this dark area, less so here. And when you get up to this bright area, it's not being applied at all, just by the function of the mask.
And you can sharpen that mask manually, so to speak, or blur it manually so that the edges are softer, sharper.
You absolutely can, but you would not want to blur a mask used for noise reduction. If you do, it will blur the stars in the mask, which will tend to blur the stars in the image. Noise reduction masks, you don't blur. Yeah. Right. Sharpening masks, you do not, sharpening mask you can blur. You can taper its effect to sort of smooth out transitions, but you don't do that with a blurring filter.
Okay.
Fabian, you got a puzzled look on your face there. Any other questions? Okay, well, we've gone through noise reduction in about half the time I figured we would. I like that. Let's take a look at, we'll take a sneak peek then at the next part of the processing, which is now that we have an image, we want to, and we've reduced the noise. So we've stretched it, we've reduced the noise. The next thing we want to do in the image is sharpen it a bit. So what we're going to do with this, I'm going to get rid of all of these dialog boxes here. We're going to take a look very quickly at some of the sharpening tools that we've got available. Now, one tool called Multi-Resolution Smooth Sharpen is quite useful. It can sharpen in any one of a bunch of different frequency bands. So think the really tiny stars and the very faint lines, if I can find one, the very sharp line there, that's controlled by finest and fine. The larger stars and the larger sort of blobs in the image, like that one and this one, those are sort of medium level detail. And then the overall brightness variation across that image, that's controlled by large and largest. So to give you an idea, now that the image has been filtered, we can sharpen this a bit. Like blurring, sharpening is best done with a mask. For now, however, just to give you an idea of what happens, I'm going to turn up the fine detail and we'll watch what it does. The stars should get a little more prominent here. There we go. So you can see the stars sharpened up a bit. And the detail in around here got a little sharper. A little hard to see, I know, but we can turn it up, for instance, even some more. There we go. Now you can, we sort of pull the history dialog back up. I'll undo it look in this area, and then I'll turn, you keep looking there, I'll turn that back on. Notice it sharpened up in this area quite nicely, right? So you can see what it did. It sharpened up the image. It brought the stars up a bit, but it also brought, you can see it right here, the noise up a little bit, right? Even after we filtered it, there's still a little bit of noise there. And if you sharpen it, that noise will get a little annoying. We're going to use exactly the opposite kind of mask that we used for noise reduction. So I'm going to undo the sharpening for just a minute. There we go. Now what we're going to do, we're going to make a mask again, but this time it's just going to be a standard luminance mask. We're not going to invert it. So the idea is here, where the mask is bright, the sharpening will be applied. Where the mask is dark, i.e. the background, the sharpening will not be applied. Okay, and we'll save that mask. I have to just save the mask. And again, we could stretch that if we want it using a levels tool. I'm not just at this point, just to see the effect. So now what we're going to do, we're going to really sharpen up the image, even a little grossly so. You should be able to see now, see the noise in this area. Now what we're going to do, we're going to apply that same mask. Same thing, you select mono image and you select paste mask. And now you can see what's happened. It didn't apply as much sharpening out here where the nebula is dim, but in here where the nebula is bright, it sharpened things up quite a bit. And all the stars are nice and sharp. We can play around with the stretch on the mask to get the effect exactly the way we want, but give you an idea here. If we see that got slightly blurrier here, if we then dial it up, watch it get sharper. See the effect? Right, and as I said, we can probably now get a little more carried away with the sharpening than we could without the mask. So let's just see what we can get here just sort of quickly. We'll turn up medium a little bit as well. There's a reasonably sharpened image. The stars are starting to bloat just a little bit. There's a way to prevent that, but we won't get into that tonight. Probably gone too far here. Oh, it's not too bad. Watch what happens now when I take the mask off. Yuck. You see all the noise in this area here? Turn the mask back on and the whole effect blends together quite nicely. There you go. Now, John, remember when you asked if you can blur the noise reduction mask, and I said you really shouldn't. This mask for sharpening, you can. So I can take that mask and blur it ever so slightly. I could have gone to File Open, by the way, and gotten the mask, but you can also just click Display Mask and it will load it up as a file. I can now blur this using any of the blur tools that I want. I'd probably use just a Gaussian blur. Smooth out the mask a little bit so I get less abrupt transitions, which is the whole purpose for smoothing things. And once it's done, there we go. You can even blur it more. We'll get a little excessive in the blur here just to show you what I mean. There we are. So now there's a rather excessively blurred mask. But because you're sharpening an image, the blur actually helps to smooth out the transition, which is what John was mentioning before. So here's now, oops, I guess I have to save the mask first. Save. There we go. So now the mask is here. And if I click apply, you can see it's smoothed out the transition across here. There's not quite so much noise anymore. See the difference? It's pretty subtle, but it is the usual trick is to make a sharpening mask, which is just a luminance mask. You blur it just a little bit to smooth out the edges a bit, and then you apply it to your data. Now, like I said, I've turned the the sharpness up to ridiculous levels here. If we sort of reset this one and click apply, even that is a little much. When I say a little much, the stars got a little abrupt. That's not too bad. So now if you look at what that did in the core area, there's the blurred image. The noise reduced image, it's not blurred, it's just, that's what it looked like sort of coming off the camera. If we then apply the sharpening with the mask, you see the difference in this area in here, a little more detail, a little crisper, right? And not a lot of increase in noise, because by the time you get down here where all the noise exists, the mask is preventing the sharpening from being applied down there. If we we did a pretty good job in reducing the noise in that area to begin with. But if I take the mask off, you should be able to see the noise come up a bit. Yeah, you can see it in this area here, right? And if we put the mask back on, that should then go away. There it is. It sort of left it a little more blurred in that area. So that's the effect of a mask on both sharpening and noise reduction. And you really always want to do those two things with a mask applied. There's a whole variety of masks you can use. You can even use a mask that selects edges. So you would get a little ring where all the stars are, and you'd get lines along here, right? And then you can really go nuts with the sharpening and get really sharply defined lines through there. Some people like that look. I'm not a big fan of it, but you can do all those tricks with masks.
Question for you. Those stars in the center there now, we're just starting to see a bit of a donut showing up. Okay?
Yes, and if you...
What was doing that?
That is an artifact of the wavelet Sharpen. ImagesPlus does have this little function called reduce artifacts. It's on most sharpening tools. And if I do that, it'll slightly reduce the sharpening, but it should get rid of those donuts you're talking about there, Jerry. Can you see the effect there? The donuts are gone now. But we still have some sharpening.
I still see donuts.
I don't know what you're looking at because I don't see any. I'll tell you what, I'm going to park my mouse. Can you see my mouse going around this star?
Yeah.
Okay, tell me where's a star with a donut relative to that?
1 inch across to the left.
To the left, this way?
Yeah, keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going. Stop. Now, the biggest one down below you there.
This one?
No, one more down to the right.
One more down to the right, this one?
Yeah, it appears in my screen to be a bit of a centered donut area.
Oh, when you say donut, you're talking about the star getting that sort of darker center.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, sorry. When you said donut, I was looking for a hole around the outside of the star.
Right.
Yeah, no, I know what you mean. That is a function of applying sharpening to a very bright target, and you can fix that very easily. It's a more complicated topic than I was going to get into tonight, but basically you make that same luminance mask, but without any stars. There's a function called the feature mask tool right here that lets you split an image out into stars and no stars. So stars and everything else. Then you would apply the sharpening to everything else, put the image back together, and you would have perfect stars and a nice sharp nebula. Little further than I had planned on getting into tonight, but I can certainly show it to you. We certainly have lots of time.
Just the alternative to this approach is that the StarNet that makes starless masks.
Yes, it does.
Yeah. Okay.
StarNet makes a starless image, as does the feature mask. StarNet is more automated, and it's the only other tool I've found that's as good as ImagesPlus for making masks. StarNet will typically make a better mask with, better mask is the wrong phrase. It will make a mask with fewer stars on most images than ImagesPlus will. The problem is that when you get an image where it can't completely remove the star, it leaves you with a mess that's really hard to clean up. ImagesPlus doesn't. So to give you an idea, let's just undo the sharpening that we did there. Undo that, just a minute. There we go. So now we've noise reduced, we have sharpened. Sorry, we have not yet sharpened. I'm going to close down some things here. And we have that image. What I'm going to do, Jerry, and we will go over this in much more detail some other night, so don't get caught up on trying to follow every note here, but if I use the feature mask, I set a star radius here. So what this says is anything with this radius or less, it will assume is a star. And we'll sort of dial it up just a little bit. And then this is a threshold, but I don't adjust that until, okay, so there we are. It's going to take out those stars. It'll leave these little tiny guys. You can get rid of those with this selection here. Now we're going to put the fill radius on, and what that's going to do is that's going to say go 3 pixels away from the dark area and fill that in. That will leave some halos. Again, we can adjust these to get rid of almost all the halos, but for what we're doing right now, the halos won't matter. So we'll get, there we go. And then we're going to say split the stars out of that. So this was the image. These are the halos left from the stars. And here are the stars. You get that just by splitting out the stars. Now what we're going to do, we're going to go back to this image. And we're going to make another luminance mask, just like we did before. And we'll store it. Remember to hit save, we'll store it, there we go. And then we're going to sharpen this image up, but now it doesn't have the bright cores of the stars in it anymore. And we'll use exactly the same tool we used before with approximately the same sharpen. And then we'll even dial it up a little more here. And we'll apply the mask just like we did before. And it's a mono image mask. I'll show you what a control point mask is before the night is through up too. That comes in kind of handy every now and then. So now let's just see what that looks like with and without the sharpening. So you can see you got a little fuzzier in this area. We'll then apply the sharpening. There we go. Now what we'll do, we'll add the 2 images back together. We'll put, in other words, we'll put the stars back in. You do that with combining the images using blend mode, opacity, and masks. This is a standard sort of layer type processing that's available in Photoshop as well. These are just layers now. But ImagesPlus has a special blend mode called Merge Split, and it automatically selected it for the star layer. You'll notice Merge Split. Now, if we zoom in, Jerry, the problem you were seeing, hopefully, is gone. Let me see here. I'll go down to those bright stars. And you notice the stars don't have those donut holes in the middle anymore.
They do have a bit more of a ring, though.
They have that little halo around them, and that's just because I didn't match the star size. As I said, I did that fairly quickly. I just wanted to show you that by separating the stars out of the image, you can get rid of the halos, or not the halos, that donut in the middle. In order to get rid of that halo, you select more of the star. So for example, let's close, we'll undo the stuff to this guy. We undo the sharpening. once it wakes up. There's a couple of ways of doing it. I could have also just reduced the size of the halos here, but I'll show you the other technique here. Okay. Feature mask. Let's close this window down. So here we are back at our original image. This is what we used for the stars in the original technique that we applied. What I'm going to do now, I'm going to say select a little bit bigger star, and I'm going to say, oops, wait till I finish this, let me take a second. Then I'm going to say increase the size, arbitrarily increase the size of the star that I'm selecting. Now you notice more of the stars have gone away. It's transferred that data out to the star image now. So the stars here will now be bigger. Now I can go and sharpen this. And if I did that right, I won't bother putting the mask on just for now. It won't make any difference in terms of what we're trying to show here. And if I put these back together and I selected the stars big enough, hopefully we have a sharpened image with no weird artifacts around the stars. And if that doesn't do it, I have to reduce the size of the halos a bit. There you go, that looks pretty good, Jerry. There's a more normal looking star.
Yeah, yeah.
And I didn't use the mask when we sharpened it, so you can see all the noise that came up in the dim area there. But that gives you an idea of how powerful that feature mask tool can be. You can even go in, for instance, I can take this image and I could further noise reduce it, do whatever I wanted without fear of blurring out the stars, because there's no stars in the image for the most part. Then I can add them all back in after the fact. Anyway, that's a topic for another night on how you can do some of that stuff. It's called split star processing. You can use it, for instance, I can take this portion right now and I can stretch this without touching the stars. One of the problems you run into when you stretch an image, you always end up bloating the stars. But if there's no stars in the image, or very few of them, you tend to reduce the bloat quite a bit. So for instance, if we just apply a simple curve, I better select the right image here. If we apply a simple curve, and maybe dial the contrast up a bit. Ooh, that's a little too much. So now we've increased the contrast in that image somewhat substantially, which would normally bloat the heck out of the stars. There will still be a little star bloat here, but it shouldn't be too bad. Let's see what happens. There we go. So you can see the stars didn't bloat, right? Nowhere near as much as they would have if we applied that same curve to the image when the stars were in it. You'd have big blobs for stars. But anyway, that's topic for another session. Tonight's session was mostly on noise reduction, and I just wanted to touch on sharpening. We'll do sharpening in more detail. Oh, is that ever a pun? We'll do sharpening in more detail on another night. Any questions so far? I'm going to assume then that it was a perfectly explained session as opposed to I put everybody to sleep, which is probably the more appropriate thing that happened. No questions at all?
I'm going to wait and try number 2.
Fair, fair enough. And I will type up another little document describing what was done. It won't have exactly the same settings as I've used here on noise reduction. It'll just have what I remember. And when Jerry pops the video up, then I can get it exact. I'm assuming you had this recording, Jerry?
Yes, it is recording, I hope. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
And I think at that point, Jerry, I have to figure out how to give you the host duties back. What did you
Do the
click
same
to
thing
do
in
that?
reverse. Do
What's
the same
that?
thing in reverse. Participants, do the same thing in reverse that Jerry did.
Yeah, the only trouble is I don't know what Jerry did.
Oh, participants. Click on participants.
I clicked on you and said make host. So
Yep.
Okay. So if I click on
You click on Jerry.
something, I can find Jerry here. Bear with me.
Yep.
He's in here somewhere.
I don't see him either. I know he's here.
I can.
Oh, he's
I can hear
Halifax. He's Halifax Center.
Ah, that's why. Yes. So if I click there and I say make host, Jerry,
Yep.
you should now be the host.
I
There you
have
go.
I have power now. Yes.
Yes. So as I said, that gives everyone an idea on how you can use ImagesPlus to noise reduce your images. There are several tools that are very handy for it. Obviously, they're all under the Smooth Sharpen menu. The standard smoothing tool is somewhat useful if you just have a little bit of noise. Some of those adaptive filters are quite good. But generally speaking, when I noise reduce my images, I will use the reduce high-low bloomed pixel function to get rid of any hot pixels. And then I'll go straight to a frequency filter with a mask to get the result I want. Other functions work as well, none work as fast. The frequency filter is quite quick given the size of the images. For a camera like Jerry's, he will really appreciate the frequency filter. It is substantially faster. And the mask gives you basically, the mask basically turns it into a perceptual filter where it's not applied to areas of the image that have a high SNR. In other words, the bright areas. It's only applied to the dim areas. And you can stretch the mask to tailor that effect. You can even draw or paint on the mask. So if there's a bright area in your image, sort of like the dust lane near the core of M8 there, and you wanted to protect that from any blurring at all, you could literally paint the mask black in that area. There's no need, because it's a blurring filter, there's no need to blur that transition in the mask. It won't show up as an abrupt transition. If you were sharpening, it would show up as an abrupt transition and you would want to then blur it a bit. But for noise reduction, you don't blur the mask. Okay, any other questions? Ooh, this is an easy night.
Blair,
Okay, folks.
That's great. Thank you very much.
You're more than welcome. So far we have covered, we've covered the stretching of an image, we've covered noise reduction, and probably in the next go around, we'll take a look at some of the sharpening filters that are available. Those are the three usual steps in the workflow. So it's usually you stretch an image, you reduce the noise in the image, and then you sharpen the areas that you want in the image. That's a very broad brush workflow. There's lots of things you can do in between. We haven't talked about removing bands in images and all that sort of stuff. That's all covered on Mike Unsold's webpage, on the ImagesPlus webpage. He's got all sorts of tutorials there. It is definitely worth a read, but it is not indexed, so you have to go hunting.
Search.
Okay. Thank you for attending, folks. And
Hey,
Thank you for doing this.
Troy has asked a question.
oh, sure, go ahead.
With a nebula, will these methods work with star clusters or galaxies too?
Absolutely, they will. As long as you make your mask and stretch it to the point where the stars are fairly black, it will leave all the stars in the star cluster and blur out the background. I'll tell you what, one second here. Just to give Troy an idea about what I'm talking about here, I have to bear with me while I look to see if I have a particular file on this computer. I'm pretty sure I do. Well, let's see here. Pulling up an urban image of the M7 star cluster here, and I just want to stretch it to make sure it's actually got some stars in it. Bear with me.
Yep, it's got a few.
Okay, that doesn't have, that's not M7. That's,
Looks like it.
it's a globular. I'm not sure which one, but it will work for purposes of this description. Jerry, do you want to give me back the host duties there so I can share my screen?
Oh, your screen is shared.
Oh, my screen is shared. Okay.
Yeah, you never stopped sharing.
Oh, that's good. So here is a star cluster. It's a globular star cluster. And I'm just going to turn the background up a bit. It's an urban image of a globular star cluster. I do not know what globular this is, before anyone asks. I think it's M5, but I won't swear to that. And you can see the background is quite noisy. Everybody see that? So what we're going to do, we're going to, I'm just going to stretch that a little bit more here. Bring up some of the faint odor stars, and of course, bring up the noise floor somewhat substantially. There we go.
Yes.
I'm overstretching the image so you can really see the noise. So now if we go down here, it's actually a slightly out of focus image as well, which is one of the reasons I've never posted it anywhere. But there's the star cluster. So you can now see all of the noise in that image, right? What we're going to do is we're going to take out any hot pixels, just as we did before. We'll just sort of turn this up a bit. Maybe too many in there.
I thought it was only my pictures that looked like that with all the noise.
Oh no, this is standard for urban imaging. I'm going to eat a cracker while I wait here. Bear with me as it goes through, and there we go. So now we've removed all the hot pixels, and what we're going to do is make a mask. Same procedure. Make a luminance mask. You can got a satellite in it, or I'm guessing that's a satellite, not a meteor. What we're going to do now, whoop, no, I can get it from there too. We're going to make the negative of that mask, and then I'm going to darken the stars and brighten the background using a levels control. So we darken the stars, we brighten up the background, probably about there maybe even a little more. There we go. We'll save that as a mask. And then what we're going to do is, again, I'll use the frequency filter, my sort of go-to filter for this stuff. It's not always the perfect filter. Sometimes it won't take out the finest noise. Then you can use one of the other blurring tools like any of those adaptive filters in the first one that I showed you. Let's see if we can get rid of most of this noise with a frequency filter. This is without the mask applied, of course. So the stars will blur, but I'm interested in what the background looks like once it finishes. That's not too bad. We can blur that a little bit more. That's interesting, Jerry. Once you let me be the host and I shared my screen, I now have screen sharing capability that I didn't have before. So you can see that quieted down the background quite a bit. There is some of that fine-grained noise in there. We'll take that out in the end. But now we'll apply the mask to that. And now you see you get your stars back. The background is substantially better than it was. and you have a globular star cluster, right? So if we now undo that filtering, so you see all the noise that was originally in that image, right? You can see all the noise. Turn the filter back on, presto, noise goes away, right? And you still have all of the stars reasonably sharp in the image. Now, if I zoom right in on this image to 100%, there is still some fine-grained noise that didn't come out. That would be removed with this selective neighborhood or absolute difference. I'll use selective neighborhood simply because it's faster. And I would then apply the same mask to this. So let's just sort of see if I can smooth that out a little bit more. That didn't do too bad a job there. We can do a little more. There we are. So that smoothed out most of it. It did make the stars a little blurry, so we would again apply that same mask. I may have overdone it there a bit. The stars are starting to look just a little unnatural there. Let me just go down to 50% so we can get the whole globular in. Oop, too far. Yeah, that was a little too much. I'll take that out. I probably would have to take that fine-grained noise out first, not last. But at any rate, you can see the effect of applying that filter with a mask. You get the globular, right? You get a reasonably smooth background. This image would now be ready for reducing the background level a bit and then sharpening to bring out the stars quite nicely. You know, so if we were to say, let's take that background down to something reasonable. I'd also crop this image. It's got some stacking artifacts. Let's get rid of those. You can see them here from dithering. So sort of if we just crop all that stuff out.
Normally you would have done that at the beginning?
It doesn't really matter when you do it. So there we are there. Now there's no stacking artifacts. So now when I use the levels control, I should have a smooth edge here on my histogram, and I can dial black up a bit. Now it's starting to look a little bit better, as you can see. And I probably want to reduce the red light pollution a little bit in that image. Reduce RGB. Reduce red just a little bit is the most likely culprit for that. Yeah, it's starting to get closer. And then, you know, you would do all the usual things of setting the background color. Where's a good spot in the background? This looks like a good spot. There we are. So now we got a globular cluster. It's got lots of red stars. There's probably precious few blue stars in there, which sort of makes sense for a globular cluster. Let's just see here. And then the only other thing I do to this image now at this point is sharpen it up. Keep in mind this is an urban image, so it's never going to look like a dark sky image, but it's not too bad. If I wanted to sharpen that image up, again, we do the same thing. There's a variety of sharpening tools that work really well on these kinds of images. I'm just going to close down a few windows here, bear with me. This one would probably respond quite well to deconvolution, but that's a topic for another evening. We'll use that multi-resolution sharpen, which should do a pretty good job. And we'll take fine and sort of turn that up a bit. And there you have your stars. So now you have a globular cluster image with a reasonably quiet background and reasonably sharp stars. There you go. That'll give you an idea of how you can use that same technique on a star cluster. Any other questions?
Yeah, Blair, I've got a question. It's Wayne.
Hi, Wayne.
First of all, hi to everybody joining us this evening.
Blair, I have a question that's not necessarily an ImagePlus question. It's a hardware question I have.
Mhm.
I don't know if you want to answer that right now or maybe later.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, I'm getting into some video work. Primarily, it's going to be solar and lunar with some planetary, not so much deep sky.
Yep.
I'm looking at getting Malincam equipment.
Okay.
And I'm a little torn between whether I should go with a color unit or with a monochrome unit. Now, I understand for both solar and lunar, you can get away quite easily with the monochrome. It provides more sensitivity. And if you go with the color, you're really, I understand, losing part of the functionality because of the Bayer matrix. There's certain portions of that. I've heard as high as 2/3 of your sensor isn't being used. Do you have any comment on that? And more specifically, which way should I maybe be looking at? Because Rock Malin is saying, oh no, the color software and the color camera, it can all shift easily to black and white, but aren't you changing the construction of the sensor?
In order to get, how can I word this? In most cameras, in order to get color, you put a filter matrix over the sensor. And it's usually a 4x4 matrix. So what typically happens is they favor green because green is where your eye is most sensitive. So you typically get a matrix that could be red, green, green, blue, or red, green, blue, green, but it will typically have 2 greens for every one of the other colors. However, you do not lose sensitivity in the sensor. That comment has been around forever, and it is, I'm going to be very polite and say false. What happens is the sensitivity of a given pixel is the same. Now, with one caveat, there is a filter there. So you do have, for instance, the red pixel has a red filter over it. That means it does not see blue and it does not see green. And there is a certain loss going through the filter. It's fairly low, but it will not be quite as sensitive as a monochrome pixel. However, you're imaging the moon and planets, so what difference does it make? It could be virtually blind and you still have enough light. But it's not virtually blind. It might be 80 to 85% rather than 90 to 95% of the monochrome camera. So you do not lose a lot of light on a pixel by pixel basis. You do lose resolution because all pixels don't see light. What I mean by that is if you're taking a black and white image and you're making a color image out of it by using 3 different filters and taking 3 different pictures and putting them together, what happens is you get all of the pixels picking up each individual color. So when you have the red filter on, you have, let's, for argument's sake, say your camera was 100 by 100 pixels. If you put a red filter over that monochrome camera, it now gets red, but it gets 100 by 100 red pixels. Then you put a green filter over it and it gets 100 by 100 green pixels and so on. If you take a picture with a Bayer matrix camera, i.e. a color camera, then only 1/3 of the pixels, did I do my math right? 1/3? Mm-hmm. 1/4 of the pixels see red, 1/4 of the pixels see blue, and half the pixels see green. So you do not get the same resolution. However, you get more resolution than your optics can provide. So it doesn't matter. You then use interpolation and it fills in the missing values and you lose virtually nothing. That's not to say you lose 0. You do lose a little tiny bit, and I would defy anybody to find it. It happens because the image is grossly oversampled with modern cameras. In other words, for a given star, I'll give you an example here. I'll pull up that image we just looked at. This guy. So here is that image we just looked at, and it's nothing but stars. So I'm going to zoom in to 100%. See this star right here? It's a whole lot more than 1 pixel. This image is highly oversampled. There's many, many pixels making up that star. Matter of fact, you can see how many there are if I pull up the line profile and I draw a line across that star. We'll get a plot of the pixel intensity across that line. So here's the shape of that star right here. If you look, that star starts about here, which is, let's see, where's my mouse? So that's at about 590 roughly, and it goes all the way out to 638. So there's over 40 pixels across that star. So when I go to interpolate between pixels, I have many, many pixels to use in the interpolation function. As a result, I'm able to get a very accurate interpolation of the data that's there. It's because the image is way oversampled. And almost all modern cameras will be grossly oversampled. Certainly any DSLR will be. If you have a small sensor, however, that might not be the case. It might not be as oversampled then, which would mean then that you would need a bigger focal length telescope or a longer focal length telescope to get oversampling. But basically, that's the way interpolation works. You're oversampled so you can throw away some of the pixels and get them back just by averaging across it. So you don't lose a whole lot by going to a color camera.
Yeah.
You know, if someone says you lose something, absolutely you do. You can lose resolution if you're not oversampled. Do you lose a lot? Not enough to notice.
I agree that the conversation's been going on, it seems, forever with regards to the purists who say monochrome. If you want a shot in the sun, monochrome, that's the way to go. But there are some fabulous images out there where people have colorized after the fact, you know, with incredible amounts of detail and the prominences and things like that. And I have trouble as a relative newbie to this, to that form of astrophotography. I really can't tell the difference, and I'm searching and searching, looking for some of these things that people are talking about. But again, the purists will say, nope, gotta have monochrome. And yet other folks are saying you'll never notice using a color camera.
And I can prove, it's funny, this is my day job, not with images, but with signal processing in the 1D sense. So it's taking in acoustic signals, for example, and running these same types of algorithms on those acoustic signals. And we do this all the time. All of the people that, as you describe them, purists, I would describe a purist as, hopefully I'm not going to insult anybody here, as an audiophile. Someone who thinks they know something about audio, but in truth knows nothing. They're the same people that buy monster cable at $500 a foot.
Yeah.
It doesn't do anything. You can completely model a cable as a resistor, an inductor, and a capacitor, multiple stages thereof. Monster cable doesn't do anything. There is no such thing as an acoustic waveguide, but people will buy it. Back in the 80s, people used to buy, it was a marketing genius. They used to buy something called the acoustic brick. It was a cinder block covered in velvet, and you put it on top of your amplifier to improve the sound. Go figure out how. But they sold it for $200 a brick. And the guy made a killing. A lot of the purists out there in astrophotography are in the same category. They do not know the theory. They know what worked for them. And you will find a lot of them have Another area of astrophotography or photography in general where people have difficulty is in flat fields. You will find all sorts of mythology out there on flat fields. And it's not based on knowledge, it's based on, I did this, it worked, therefore it's the only way to do it. And cameras fall into that same category. I have had monochrome cameras. I work with the engineering required to produce them, and I have designed them in my day job. And I can tell you, if you can distinguish between a monochrome camera with 3 filters and a good bare camera, someone did something wrong in the design of the camera, because they are indistinguishable once they are oversampled. And you should design your optical system so it is oversampled. That's another myth that's out there. People try and say, I want critical sampling where I have exactly the right number of pixels. Problem is, when you're critically sampled, you don't have any room for error. You can't average pixels to bring down noise because you lose resolution when you do so. But if you are oversampled, you can do all that fun processing. So it is always better to be oversampled, not critically sampled. You know, you will find all sorts of things out there with people claiming things that in some cases they are correct. So I will give you an example of one that is correct but meaningless. There is a large contingent of usually PixInsight users that insist you must do deconvolution before you do any nonlinear process. And mathematically, they are absolutely correct. However, fundamentally, when you look at the images produced both ways, it makes no difference. I can't argue with them. They are correct. You should not deconvolve a non-linearly stretched image because you can't use a star as the point spread function anymore. But the simple fact is you don't have to. You can generate an artificial star and use it and still sharpen your image. So is it mathematically correct? No. Does it make a pretty picture? You bet it does. That's what most people are in astrophotography for. Someone who wants a scientific image doesn't apply a nonlinear function to the image to begin with because they want the linearized data. These people tend to lose sight of the end goal and get lost in the forest because there's too many trees. They don't see the big picture.
Yeah, it sure looks, it seems like that on some of the discussion threads I've seen. And
yeah, the simple matter is, if it is a good quality camera, you won't be able to tell the difference. And if you are imaging Jupiter, you need a color camera. Good luck changing filters fast enough to be able to get several minutes of video to make a good Jupiter image when after 3 minutes, the planet moves enough that your image blurs. So you shoot for 3 minutes on one filter. You can't now put another color filter in and shoot because all the detail is moved. So, you know, color cameras are a must when you're imaging Jupiter. Not so much the other planets, they don't rotate as quickly, but Jupiter definitely does. So, you know, I would not say, if someone wanted to give me a really nice monochrome camera, I would not say no. But if they gave me the monochrome camera and said, here, it's much better than a color camera, I'd smile sweetly, say thank you, and all the whole time I'd be saying, yeah, right. The simple fact is you won't be able to tell the difference, Wayne.
yeah.
So
Okay.
go with the best camera you can afford, whether it is monochrome or color.
Yeah, well, again, that's why I was kind of digging around, because they can get expensive.
Oh yeah.
And that's just the start. Then you buy all the rest of the peripherals that go in there.
And
everything
if
else.
if you plan on imaging Jupiter, your choice is made for you. You need a color camera.
Yeah.
The assumption is you want a color image of Jupiter. If you want a black and white image, then a monochrome camera is okay.
Yeah. Well, again, the primary use will be for solar. and then lunar, and then some planetary afterwards. But again, you won't have the ability to go with all three if you are limiting yourself to a monochrome. So it gives you a little flexibility down the road, but that's not the primary purpose of it.
One caveat to the explanation I just gave you. If you're doing solar imaging, in particular HA solar imaging.
And that's what I'm doing.
Okay, if that is your primary intent, then the argument I just made to you does not hold.
I give up.
The reason is simple. If you're doing HA imaging, there's no light hitting the blue pixels or the green pixels.
Yeah.
So you have effectively thrown those pixels away. The description I gave you assumes you were seeing white light so that you get light on all of the pixels. If you're using a very narrow band filter, then what happens is you still get, if you're oversampled, by the way, it still works. It's just the algorithms that do the interpolation have a more difficult time because there is no green light and there is no blue light. The HA filter removes it.
Yeah, I'm using an older pre-Meade Coronado dual stack.
Yeah.
And for solar imaging, I'm using a Pronto.
Yeah.
So between the two coming together, it's a pretty good system. And I do use white light.
One thing you could do as a quick test for yourself, do you have a DSLR that you can put on the Pronto?
Yeah. I have a 40D.
Okay. Put your 40D on the Pronto, take a picture and see how it looks. If it looks okay, that gives you your answer. What happens is the Pronto is going to prevent light from blue and green from hitting the blue and green pixels. However, it's probably oversampled using the DSLR and then everything will be okay. If it's not oversampled, then you would have a problem. It would definitely be, if you're doing narrow band imaging in one band, so you're using just HA, then a monochrome camera will have an advantage. But that's the only time it will have an advantage.
Yeah, and from what I've read, it'll be an advantage, but it may not be worth going through all the trouble of having two cameras. This isn't scientific sort of thing. It's just basically for educational outreach.
Yeah, that is exactly correct.
Yeah.
And the advantage to having a color camera, especially if you decide to dabble in a little bit of imaging of planets, is you get color pictures of the planets.
Exactly.
You could do that by switching filters, but it's a real pain in the butt.
Well, Mellencam also have on their software, you can flip from color to monochrome.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah. So there's that option too. So listen, you've been really helpful, Blair. And as always, and appreciate your input. Yeah, well, the decision's being made this weekend, so, and I think it will be color. So thanks once again.
It's not going to hurt. Like I said, you will be hard pressed to tell the difference, even if you're doing narrow band imaging. But fundamentally, for narrow band imaging, the absolute best would be a monochrome camera. But you won't see the difference. The cameras have just gotten so good, the pixel counts are so high that fundamentally you're oversampled and it won't make any difference.
Yeah. Thanks once again, Blair.
You're welcome.
Blair, I assume that argument would go as well for dual band pass filters.
Less so for dual band, but yes. And by the time you get to tri-band, then it doesn't hold at all because you've got all three colors there. Yeah.
Okay.
I'll give you an example of a dual band filter. If you've been looking at any of the images that Jeff has been getting, or Ron Brecher up in Guelph, both are using color cameras with dual band filters, and their images are just fine. Good luck finding any difference. You know, I wouldn't go to Ron and say, Ron, your image is crap because you're using a color camera. I would I would be rather foolish to do so because his images are wonderful.
Good, thank you.
You're welcome.
As usual.
Anything else, gentlemen?
I just wanted to add that the addition, if you're doing, I believe Wayne said he was going to be doing video. When you go to the, the argument for color versus monochrome and filters, of course, as Blair said, you got the whole problem with Jupiter. That just sort of goes, okay, I guess we're not doing Jupiter. But the other thing too is that by the time you're imaging anything with a video camera, how many thousands of frames are you going to be stacking?
On a good night when I'm shooting Saturn, and I pick Saturn, not Jupiter, because Saturn is virtually unlimited, I might stack 20, 30, 40,000 frames.
Exactly.
It's easy to do, right? You grab the video, you sick the software on it, and you go to bed, and you pick up the result in the morning. It's not difficult to stack tens of thousands of frames. Jupiter, on the other hand, I probably only get a couple of hundred before the detail moves enough and it would blur out, simply because Jupiter rotates quite quickly.
We should be able to give it 50 or so frames per second, would you not?
Sorry, say that again?
I said you should be able to get 50 or so frames per second, would you not, in a video?
You can get 50, you can get, at least with my camera, I can get 60 frames a second at full resolution, but only the central part of the sensor, it crops it. And that's more than enough for Jupiter. But think about it, if I'm shooting for probably the maximum you can get on Jupiter is 2 to 3 minutes before the detail moves enough that it would blur the image. So if I'm shooting 60 frames a second and, I've got 60 seconds a minute, I don't get that many tens of thousands of frames on Jupiter before it begins to blur. And then when I stack them, of course, it throws away a good chunk of those frames because I'm doing lucky imaging and they're not all nice and sharp and perfect. So by the time you're done, you only end up with 300-400 frames to stack on Jupiter out of 3 minutes.
I've heard of some software for stacking for Jupiter. I don't know the name. I didn't catch that on a podcast.
It's actually called WinJup. And what it does is
model, yeah.
It has a model of Jupiter and it attempts to slide the images around so that they all line up. It knows the rotation rate of Jupiter and the differential rotation between the bands. It's actually a really awesome software package. But even with that, you only get so long before you simply, by the time one image you start and the red spot is, at the edge of Jupiter, and by the time you finish, it's a quarter of the way over, you will never stack that.
On imaging the sun, my understanding is that it's not so much the number of exposures that you would have, because typically, because the sun is so bright, the exposures are very, very, very short, and you don't have to take that many to start stitching them together, so you can get an animation on a prominence as it kind of releases itself from the sun and then loops back down. So it's not so much that there's a great number of images collected. It's just they're super, super short. And again, stitching them together that's how you put an animation together.
Yeah, and again, there's software that'll do that. So it's, if you get 10,000 images, don't think you're going to be 6 days processing it. It's just let your computer do it while you go to bed. Or in the case of solar imaging, while you have supper.
I'm certainly looking forward to it. And I appreciate all the input from everybody.
It should be entertaining. I'll have to see them when they show up.
Yeah, about 6 years from now. That's what the learning curve is going to be like.
I will make a suggestion to you that don't wait 6 years before posting an image. Find a good group for image processing online. There are several. I don't know of any for video right offhand, but I suspect Jerry does. The reason I say don't wait forever, it's a good way to learn. If you post an image that has obvious problems and you can't figure out what the problems are, chances are someone can say, oh, do this and that'll go away, and save you a lot of frustration.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm a member of the Mellencamp group, and they've already been super helpful. And we're all using the same basic type of equipment. And Rock, the developer and owner of Mellencamp, he's forever in there. And there's another gentleman in the States who's the worldwide distributor for the camera. He's constantly in there. So they're using a network to actually stream video of things they're looking at night live. And they're so quick to help and provide information. It's a really good group. But I find that generally across astronomy as a hobby, especially in the astro imaging community. It's just people are so friendly and so eager to help, and always in a very good way. So you're absolutely right. Throwing the stuff out there and getting comments is the way you really learn.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, for those that want to do processing of standard astrophotos, not solar images, although we do solar images every now and then too, there's a group on Groups.io. I'm one of the 4 moderators on that group, and its whole purpose in life is to do what you just said. We pick an image about once every 2 months, and everybody works on the same image and posts the results, usually along with a workflow about how they did it. It's a great way to learn, because when you're starting off, you never know if it's because you've captured crappy data or you have crappy processing. Speaking from personal experience, it was both. But it's a great way to learn, because everyone's working on the same image and you get other people to compare your image to, and you started with the same data. So then you can say, okay, you managed to get this piece of the nebula to show up. How the heck did you do that? And they'll tell you.
Yeah, the Mellencamp group is actually part of the Group.io.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, most of the groups have moved from Yahoo to Groups.io, because Yahoo has pretty much stopped support for groups in all forms. Okay. Any other questions, gentlemen? There's one question in the chat window. Oh, sorry, that's from that's from Troy, and I had answered that with the processing of that I guess it was M5. But I think that was everything. Okay, well, good evening, folks.
Blair, thank you very much again.
You're more than welcome.